My name is Emma Harrison, and I am 32 years old. 10 years ago, my father sat at the head of our mahogany dining table, pointed a carving knife at my chest, and called me dead weight to my face. My older brother laughed. His girlfriend giggled. Nobody defended me. I was 22, and in that single moment, I learned that in my family, my silence was the only currency they respected. For a decade, I fetched their coats, attended their dinners, and let them treat me like an underachieving assistant. But what they did not know was how I weaponized that silence. 2 nights ago, my father stood up in a crowded steakhouse and announced he was handing 90% of his multi-million-dollar logistics company to my brother, leaving me 10% on a leash. He thought he was putting me in my place. He had no idea. He had just handed the keys to the kingdom to a forensic auditor who was about to dismantle his entire life. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Maye Tells Stories, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and drop your age, location, and local time in the comments. I want to know who is listening right now. Now let me take you back to Birmingham, Alabama, to a sweltering July evening 10 years ago, and the moment I stopped being a daughter and became a liability. The air conditioning inside my father's dining room hummed a low, steady note against the suffocating summer heat. I sat at the table, staring at the condensation sliding down my iced tea glass. My father, Richard, stood at the head of the table, carving a prime roast. He paused with the knife hovering in the air and gestured toward me with the silver blade. "Emma is just dead weight right now," he stated. He did not raise his voice. He delivered the assessment between bites of asparagus, treating my worth as a casual observation. Across the table, my older brother Chase let out a short, nasal laugh. He had just been named vice president of Harrison Logistics. His girlfriend Lauren sat beside him, twisting a diamond promise ring and offering a sympathetic, condescending pout. No one argued. No one defended me. I picked up my fork, speared a piece of potato, and chewed. I swallowed the insult along with the food. Crying would only validate their premise. Arguing would require capital I did not yet possess. So I banked the data. I let them think they understood the board. Unaware, I had already started playing a different game. Over the next 10 years, the venue changed, but the cast remained trapped in their established roles. I played the dutiful, unremarkable daughter. They saw a woman doing administrative tasks, living in a modest apartment, and driving a sensible sedan. They assumed my quiet demeanor signaled a lack of ambition. What my father and brother did not know was how I spent the 50 hours a week I was not fetching their coats. I worked as a senior forensic auditor for a private equity firm operating out of Atlanta. My career was built in sterile conference rooms long after midnight, tracking missing funds across offshore accounts. My job involved dissecting corporate ledgers, identifying hidden liabilities, and dismantling failing companies, piece by piece. My firm acquired distressed assets, and my signature authorized the restructuring. I spent a decade unearthing financial rot. I did not just understand balance sheets, I weaponized them. When I looked at numbers, I saw the truth people tried to hide. And when I looked at my family, I saw a ledger that did not balance. We gathered at the Ironwood, an upscale steakhouse in downtown Birmingham, to celebrate Richard's 65th birthday. The waiter poured a Cabernet that cost more than my first car. The room smelled of charred meat and heavy cologne. I wore a plain navy dress, blending into the dark leather upholstery. I arrived early and parked my sedan between 2 luxury SUVs. Chase arrived 20 minutes late in a leased Porsche Panamera. He tossed the valet key on the white tablecloth like a heavy casino chip. Lauren, now his wife, carried a designer handbag she made sure to display prominently next to her water goblet. "They are moving me to CEO by the 3rd quarter," Chase announced to the table, swirling his wine. "The expansion into the Mobile port is practically done. I have the shipping contracts mapped out." "He works too hard," Lauren chimed in, resting a manicured hand on his arm. "I keep telling him he needs to delegate more." Richard nodded approvingly from the head of the table. He is driving the ship now, doing a fine job. He snapped his fingers, gesturing toward my chair. Emma, grab my coat from the check room. The draft in here is stiff. I stood up, retrieved the claim ticket from his outstretched hand, and walked to the front of the restaurant. I handed the ticket to the hostess and waited. Any other daughter might have felt a sting of humiliation. Being ordered away from the table like hired help during a family celebration was designed to demean me. But my professional training kicked in. A forensic auditor does not get angry at a discrepancy. She notes it. I noted the way Chase bragged about the Mobile port expansion, using vague corporate buzzwords rather than hard metrics. I noted the specific designer label on Lauren's handbag and compared it to a regional vice president's salary. I noted the valet ticket for a leased Porsche. People who possess real wealth do not need to perform it so aggressively. The math felt wrong. I returned to the table and draped the heavy wool coat over Richard's shoulders. He did not say thank you. Instead, he clinked his silver knife against his crystal glass, signaling for attention. The chatter at the surrounding tables dimmed as he prepared to speak. 65 years, Richard began, clearing his throat. I built Harrison Logistics from a single warehouse in Montgomery. Now it is time to pass the torch. He placed a heavy hand on Chase's shoulder. I have finalized the succession paperwork. I am transferring 90% of the company's shares to Chase. Lauren beamed, her teeth flashing in the dim light. Chase puffed his chest out, adjusting his silk tie and trying to look solemn. Richard turned his gaze to me. It carried the same detached evaluation from 10 years ago. Emma, I am leaving you 10%, a minority stake. That way your brother can always keep an eye on you and make sure you are provided for. He raised his glass. To the future of Harrison Logistics. Chase smirked, raising his own glass. To the future. I picked up my water goblet. I met my brother's eyes over the rim, taking a slow, deliberate sip. My 10% was not a gift. It was a leash. But a leash is just a rope, and a rope can easily become a noose. The clinking of crystal glasses faded into the ambient hum of the steakhouse. My father took a long sip of his Cabernet, satisfied with his grand gesture. Chase leaned back in his leather chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He looked across the table at me, wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Look, Emma, Chase started, his tone adopting the patronizing cadence of a patient kindergarten teacher. 10% is a nice gesture from Dad, but let us be realistic. You do not know the first thing about freight logistics or port tariffs. The K-1 tax forms alone are going to be a nightmare for you to file every year. I set my water glass down. Is that right? Oh, it is a massive headache, Lauren chimed in. She reached for a piece of artisan bread, tearing it delicately. Chase spends hours dealing with corporate accountants. And with your little apartment downtown, you really do not have the space to set up a home office for that kind of paperwork. It is not like our place at the country club, where Chase has a dedicated study. I looked at Lauren. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the dim restaurant lighting. She assumed my two-bedroom apartment in Atlanta was a sign of financial struggle rather than a choice. I preferred liquid capital over depreciating assets. Chase leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I want to do you a favor, Emma. I will buy out your 10%, cash. We can value it at a flat rate, say $50,000. I write you a check next week, and you never have to worry about the corporate liabilities or the tax burden. It is clean and easy. $50,000. He was pricing a regional logistics company doing business out of the Mobile port at $500,000 total. Even a failing shipping firm possessed hard assets, fleet vehicles and warehouse real estate worth 10 times that amount. He was offering me pennies on the dollar, assuming my financial literacy stopped at balancing a basic checking account. $50,000? I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. I kept my face smooth, projecting mild confusion. That is generous, Chase, but I am just a bit overwhelmed. I have never owned shares in anything before. My father sighed, cutting into his ribeye. It is just paperwork, Emma. Chase is trying to save you a headache. Take the buyout. "I might," I said softly, "but could I just see the transition documents, just to understand what I am signing away? I know you brought the folder, Dad. You always carry the corporate binder when you meet with your lawyers." Richard paused his fork midway to his mouth. He shot a glance at Chase, who merely shrugged. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and reached down to the leather briefcase resting by his feet. He snapped the brass latches open and pulled out a thick manila folder bound with a rubber band. He tossed it across the table. It landed next to my plate with a dull thud. "Do not get grease on the signature pages," Richard muttered, "and do not pretend you understand the amortization schedules. Just look at the summary and sign the transfer." "I will be careful," I said. The waiter arrived, clearing our dinner plates and setting down a slate board of decadent desserts. Lauren immediately began photographing a slice of chocolate ganache cake with her phone. Chase ordered a glass of scotch, celebrating his impending $50,000 steal. They ignored me. They gave me the exact cover I needed. I slipped the rubber band off the folder and opened the cover. To the untrained eye, a corporate ledger is a wall of meaningless numbers and dense legal jargon. To a senior auditor, it is a narrative. A balance sheet tells a story of decisions, priorities, and failures. At my firm in Atlanta, I spent weeks digging through digital archives to find the story. Here, my father and brother handed it to me, along with dessert. I scanned the first page, the profit and loss statement for the previous fiscal year. I ran my finger down the margins, converting the figures in my head. Gross revenue was up, which aligned with the port expansion Chase bragged about, but the operating expenses were staggering. I flipped to the itemized deductions. My pulse remained steady, but my mind sharpened, focusing on the discrepancies. Harrison Logistics was bleeding cash. I saw a recurring monthly payment of $40,000 to a vendor listed as Summit Marketing Solutions. A quick mental check of the address listed matched a residential zip code near Chase and Lauren's Country Club. A phantom vendor. Chase was draining corporate funds into a shell company disguised as consulting fees to fund his luxury lifestyle. I turned the page. The equipment depreciation logs showed a fleet of delivery trucks, but the maintenance records were blank. They were logging assets they no longer owned or had already sold for scrap, inflating the company value on paper to secure operating credit. My father and brother were not passing a thriving empire down to the next generation. They were passing a live grenade. The company was drowning in toxic debt. The expansion into Mobile was not a strategic growth initiative. It was a desperate gamble to generate enough cash flow to cover the massive holes Chase had blown into the accounts. They were weeks, maybe days, away from defaulting on their primary vendor contracts. Harrison Logistics was a hollow shell. I took a slow breath, tasting the vanilla from my dessert spoon. I understood why Chase wanted to buy my 10% so cheaply. He needed me off the cap table. He was preparing to package the failing company and sell it to a larger corporate buyer to cover his tracks and walk away rich. A minority shareholder asking questions would ruin his exit strategy. I flipped past the operational expenses and moved to the liability disclosures. In my professional life, I dealt with distressed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I knew the specific hiding places negligent executives used to bury their mistakes. I looked at the long-term debt column. There were the standard warehouse mortgages and vehicle financing lines. But buried beneath a section labeled Auxiliary Capital was a single-line item that made my eyes stop moving. A high-yield commercial loan. The principal amount was $2.5 million. It carried an exorbitant interest rate of 14%, originated exactly 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Chase had just been promoted to regional director and began shopping for his first Porsche. $2.5 million was enough debt to sink a regional logistics firm if the principal was called in. The terms of the loan were aggressive. It was a mezzanine debt structure, meaning if the company defaulted, the lender had the right to convert the debt into an ownership equity stake or seize the personal assets of the guarantor. I looked at the top of the document to see which bank underwrote such a reckless loan. It was a private credit fund out of Chicago, known for predatory lending practices. No traditional bank in Alabama would have touched Harrison Logistics with those financials. Richard was a proud man, but he was also cautious. He never would have signed his name to a personal guarantee with a predatory lender. It violated every business principle he preached at the dinner table during my childhood. So who signed the guarantee? I turned to the final page of the loan agreement, the signature page. The restaurant chatter around me faded into a low, static buzz. My brother laughed at a joke Lauren told, swirling his expensive scotch. My father asked the waiter for the check, pulling out a platinum credit card. I stared down at the black ink on the heavy bond paper. The guarantor signature line was filled out. It was not Richard Harrison. It was not Chase Harrison. It was my name. I looked at the Social Security number printed neatly beneath the signature line. My Social Security number. The date of birth was mine. The attached residential address was an old apartment I rented in Montgomery during my early 20s. Chase had not just drained the company to fund his lifestyle. He had needed a clean credit profile to secure the massive loan that kept the charade going. He needed a guarantor who possessed zero existing corporate debt and a spotless financial record. He needed someone he considered too naive to ever run a credit check on themselves or ask to see the corporate books. My brother used my identity to secure $2.5 million of toxic debt. I closed the folder. I did not gasp. I did not drop my dessert spoon. My hands remained perfectly steady. I looked across the table at the man who shared my blood, the man who planned to sell the company pocket millions and leave me legally responsible for a catastrophic default. Chase smiled at me, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Take the $50,000, Emma," he said. "It is the best deal you will ever get." I smiled back. "I will think about it, Chase." I walked out of the Ironwood into the humid Alabama night, leaving my father and brother to their celebratory scotch. The valet brought my sedan, and I handed over a crisp bill with a steady hand. I merged onto the interstate, pointing my car toward my apartment. The drive offered a quiet space to process the reality of my situation. A $2.5 million fraudulent loan attached to my Social Security number carried severe consequences. The initial instinct for most people facing identity theft involves dialing the authorities. I played out that scenario in my head, watching the highway lights strobe across my windshield. If I walked into a police precinct tomorrow morning and filed a report, my father would deploy his legal team before noon. Richard possessed the resources to drag out an investigation for years. He would hire defense attorneys to claim I signed the guarantee willingly. They would paint me as a disgruntled, estranged daughter trying to extort her successful family. The local courts favored established business owners over corporate auditors living across state lines. A conventional legal battle offered them a chance to survive. I did not want them to survive. I required an execution so precise they would never see the blade fall. I unlocked the door to my apartment, dropping my keys on the entryway console. The space reflected my professional mindset: minimalist furniture, clean surfaces, and a dedicated workspace dominated by 3 high-resolution monitors. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I sat at my desk, booting up my encrypted work laptop. The glow of the screens illuminated the dark room. For 10 years, my family assumed I occupied a low-level administrative role, pushing paper for a faceless corporation. They never asked about my promotions or the certifications I earned. While Chase spent his 20s playing golf with shipping contractors and leasing German sports cars, I spent my time dissecting the financial ruins of bankrupt healthcare networks and corrupt manufacturing firms. I learned how executives hid stolen capital in offshore trusts. I mastered the art of tracking phantom inventory. The skills I acquired forged me into an apex predator in the world of private equity. Tonight, my target was not a nameless conglomerate. It was Harrison Logistics. I accessed a secure database utilized by my firm to run preliminary background checks on prospective acquisitions. I ran a query on my father's company, pulling public tax records, vendor filings, and Port Authority shipping logs. I cross-referenced the data with the numbers I had memorized from the folder at the steakhouse. The digital trail painted a vivid picture of gross incompetence and calculated theft. Chase had been bleeding the company dry for half a decade. I traced the $40,000 monthly payments designated for Summit Marketing Solutions. A deep dive into the state registry revealed the limited liability corporation belonged to Lauren. I pulled the property records for the address associated with the marketing firm. The location was not a commercial office suite. It was a mail forwarding service tucked between a dry cleaner and a discount grocery store. Lauren visited a post office box once a week to collect checks written against the labor of warehouse workers who routinely worked mandatory overtime. The theft was not sophisticated. It was lazy, arrogant, and easily detectable to anyone who bothered to look. But my father never looked. He trusted his golden son to steer the ship. The deeper I dug, the worse the foundation appeared. Harrison Logistics operated on a razor-thin margin, relying entirely on the fragile credit line secured by my stolen identity. Chase utilized the massive loan to mask the negative cash flow, creating the illusion of profitability. But predatory loans carry brutal amortization schedules. I modeled the loan on a spreadsheet. A 14% interest rate creates a crushing monthly obligation. The debt service alone consumed 80% of their net operating income. The remaining 20% could not cover fuel costs, payroll, and insurance premiums. Chase was juggling credit lines, pulling cash from one account to satisfy the minimum balances on another. The financial structure resembled a pyramid scheme running on fumes. The most alarming detail was the repayment schedule. The contract included a balloon payment triggering in exactly 82 days. A balloon payment requires the borrower to pay the entire remaining balance of the loan in a single lump sum. Harrison Logistics lacked the capital to pay a fraction of that amount. Bankruptcy was not just a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty arriving before the end of the fiscal quarter. My brother knew the ship was sinking. He needed a lifeboat, and he intended to use my financial ruin to buy his ticket to safety. I needed to understand his endgame. A man like Chase does not simply wait for the banks to foreclose. He secures an exit. I pivoted my search parameters, scanning regional business brokerage listings and unlisted corporate asset sales. Private equity firms often use confidential networks to identify distressed businesses desperate for a buyout. It took me 2 hours of parsing through encrypted broker communications and blinded company profiles to find the match. A mid-sized southern shipping and logistics firm boasting an established footprint at the Mobile port was actively soliciting acquisition offers. The asking price was $10 million. The seller promised a clean transition and minimized debt profiles. The strategy became painfully clear. Chase planned to sell the company to an outside buyer, pocket the multi-million-dollar acquisition fee, and dissolve the original corporate entity. During an asset sale, buyers typically acquire the equipment and client contracts while leaving the original debt behind with the seller. Chase would take his millions and walk away, leaving the hollowed-out shell of Harrison Logistics to default on the massive loan. When the predatory lenders came looking for their money, they would not go after Chase or my father. They would follow the signature on the guarantor forms. They would come after me. The banks would seize my assets, garnish my wages, and destroy the pristine career I spent a decade building. My brother designed a trap meant to bury me alive so he could live in luxury. I poured a glass of cold water from the kitchen, returning to my monitors as the sun began to hint at the horizon. I opened the confidential broker prospectus attached to the blinded listing. The document included a target list of prospective buyers. These were the high-tier private equity firms Chase and his broker were actively courting, hoping to lure in a corporate giant with deep pockets and a desire to expand into the Gulf Coast shipping lanes. I scrolled through the list of targeted firms, reading the names of our largest competitors. Then my eyes locked onto the fifth name on the page. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Chase had blindly sent his fraudulent prospectus to a handful of elite investment groups seeking a fast cash buyout. One of the firms he selected was Apex Capital. Apex Capital was the exact firm that signed my paychecks. My brother was trying to sell his rotting company to the very people I worked for. He had inadvertently handed me the execution block, the rope, and the lever. The glass walls of Apex Capital offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. At 7 in the morning, the office remained quiet, except for the hum of the climate control system. I walked into the main conference room carrying a single black binder. My managing partner, David, sat at the far end of the mahogany table, reviewing quarterly projections. David forged his reputation by orchestrating brutal corporate takeovers. He stripped failing companies down to their copper wiring and sold the pieces for a premium. He respected data and despised emotional attachment. I took the seat to his right and slid the binder across the polished wood. The cover displayed the sanitized prospectus for a regional shipping firm operating out of the Mobile port. I removed all identifying family markers from the presentation. I did not reveal my biological connection to the target. To David, this was simply an underperforming asset, ripe for harvest. I opened the floor by outlining the intrinsic value of the target. I highlighted their established Port Authority contracts and their physical fleet vehicles. I painted a picture of a company holding highly lucrative logistical routes. Then I dropped the hammer. I flipped to the second tab, exposing the gross financial mismanagement. I walked David through the inflated vendor payments, the phantom marketing expenses, and the crippling debt structure draining their daily operating capital. I showed him the 14% commercial loan that was weeks away from triggering a catastrophic balloon payment. The current leadership is desperate, I explained, keeping my voice devoid of inflection. They are actively soliciting a fast cash buyout to escape their own negligence. We can acquire the entire operation for a fraction of its actual market value. Once we secure ownership, we gut the executive suite, liquidate the toxic liabilities, and restructure the profitable shipping routes under our umbrella. It is a textbook distressed asset acquisition. David studied the spreadsheets running the margins in his head. He possessed a predator's instinct for spotting vulnerable prey. He closed the binder and looked up at me. The profit potential was undeniable. He tapped his pen against the leather cover and smiled. He assigned the acquisition entirely to me. I walked out of that conference room as the lead acquisition director, holding full authorization to draft the binding terms, negotiate the purchase price, and execute the final contract on behalf of Apex Capital. 2 days later, the sterile chill of my corporate office was replaced by the suffocating humidity of an Alabama afternoon. I drove back to Birmingham for a mandatory family barbecue hosted at my father's estate. The scent of hickory wood smoke mingled with expensive citronella candles burning along the edge of the custom swimming pool. I parked my modest sedan near the gated entrance and walked into the backyard. Richard held court near the outdoor bar, pouring bourbon for a group of local business associates. He loudly boasted about his brilliant succession plan and the legacy he built from nothing. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water and took a seat on a wrought iron patio chair. I played my designated role perfectly. I was the quiet, unremarkable daughter fading into the background, while the real adults discussed business. I watched my brother Chase standing by the stainless steel grill. He flipped burgers with a forced, strained enthusiasm. A thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead and soaked the collar of his designer polo shirt. The heat of the grill offered a convenient excuse, but I knew the real reason for his physical anxiety. The impending loan default hung around his neck like an anvil. He needed a massive influx of corporate cash immediately to avoid a total financial collapse. Lauren lounged on a wicker sofa a few feet away, oblivious to the ticking clock. She sipped a mimosa and loudly detailed her plans to remodel their country club home with imported Italian marble. She spent phantom money drawn from a hollowed-out company, assuming the fountain would never run dry. I observed Chase checking his phone every 3 minutes. He was desperately waiting for an email from a high-tier corporate buyer. He had no idea the buyer he prayed for was sitting 30 feet away, drinking carbonated water. Chase wiped his hands on a linen towel and walked over to my corner of the patio. He forced a casual smile, but his eyes darted around the yard, scanning for anyone paying too much attention. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his back pocket. The informal approach served as a calculated tactic. He wanted to minimize the importance of the document he was about to place in my hands. He leaned against the stone retaining wall, projecting a false sense of sibling camaraderie. "Hey, Emma," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "I am finalizing some of the transition paperwork Dad initiated at the dinner the other night. The lawyers need to register your minority stake with the state tax board. It is just a standard regulatory form to ensure you do not get hit with any unexpected capital gains fees next quarter." He handed me the folded paper and offered a pen. I unfolded the document, resting it on my knee. To a layperson, the page looked like a standard bureaucratic form filled with dense legal boilerplate. But I drafted and reviewed these exact contracts for a living. I recognized the phrasing immediately. This was not a tax registry document. It was a comprehensive waiver of shareholder rights. By signing the paper, I would legally relinquish my ability to contest a corporate sale. I would forfeit my right to review any acquisition bids, audit the final payout, or block the transfer of ownership. Chase needed my signature to ensure a smooth, frictionless sale to whatever private equity firm decided to buy his sinking ship. He needed me silenced and legally bound before the transaction closed so he could pocket the money and walk away. "Sign right there at the bottom," he instructed, pointing to the blank line with a greasy finger. "I will drop it off at the attorney's office on Monday. Saves you the trip." I stared at the signature line. A normal person discovering this level of deceit might throw the paper in his face and demand answers. But a confrontation right now would only alert my brother to my financial literacy. It would give him time to pivot, hire better defense attorneys, and find another way to bury me. I needed him to proceed with his plan feeling arrogant and victorious. I needed him to walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. I clicked the pen. 10 years ago, when I first entered the corporate auditing sector, I established a specific legal safeguard for myself. I registered an official signature for all my binding legal and financial documents. It utilized my full legal name, including my middle initial, with a distinct cursive loop. However, whenever I was forced to sign something under duress or suspected fraudulent intent, I used a secondary signature. I dropped the middle initial and printed my first name using a rigid block print. According to the state registry and my banking institutions, that block print signature held zero legal validity. It was a dead signature designed to render any forged or coerced contract null and void upon inspection. I looked up at Chase, adopting a mask of mild compliance. "Just here at the bottom?" I asked. "Yeah, just sign and date it," he replied, checking his phone again. I pressed the pen to the paper. I did not use my legal signature. I wrote my name in stiff, rigid block letters, ensuring the ink pressed deeply into the page. I dated the waiver and handed the document back to him along with the pen. Chase snatched the paper, folding it quickly and shoving it back into his pocket. He let out a long exhale, his shoulders dropping an inch as the tension left his body. He smiled at me, a genuine expression of predatory relief. He thought he had just neutralized his final obstacle. He believed he secured his exit strategy and left me holding the bag. "Thanks, Em," he said, turning back toward the grill. "I will make sure the accountants handle the rest. You do not need to worry about a thing." I watched him walk away, my pulse steady and calm. I took another sip of my sparkling water. He was right. I did not need to worry about a thing. The trap was set, and the prey had just locked the cage from the inside. 72 hours after the barbecue, I sat at my desk in Atlanta and initiated the formal acquisition process. I drafted a letter of intent on official Apex Capital letterhead. The document offered $10 million for the viable assets of Harrison Logistics. It was a staggering number, designed to blind the recipient. I structured the proposal as an asset purchase rather than a stock purchase. In the corporate world, this distinction acts as a psychological sedative for desperate sellers. An asset purchase means the buyer takes the trucks, the warehouse leases, and the client contracts, but leaves the original corporate shell and its existing debt behind. It was the exact exit strategy my brother prayed for. I signed the proposal using my formal corporate title, Lead Acquisition Director, shielding my legal name behind a wall of institutional authority. I attached the file to an encrypted email and sent it directly to the broker representing my family. The response arrived faster than a standard corporate timeline dictates. Within 4 hours, the broker returned a signed copy of the letter. The speed of their reply signaled profound desperation, masked by sheer arrogance. My phone buzzed on my desk a few minutes later. A text message from a family group chat lit up the screen. Chase posted a photograph of himself holding a glass of champagne, standing next to my father in the executive suite of their Montgomery office. The caption read, "Big things happening. New era for Harrison Logistics." They believed they had just secured a $10 million windfall from a faceless investment group. They thought their negligent reign would end in a golden parachute. They celebrated a victory while standing on a trap door. The signed letter of intent granted Apex Capital full access to the internal data room of Harrison Logistics. A data room functions as a digital vault where a selling company uploads their financial records, tax returns, and internal communications for the buyer to review during the due diligence period. Sellers often sanitize these rooms, scrubbing anything that might derail the sale. They hire consultants to delete incriminating correspondence and hide reckless expenditures. But digital sanitation leaves tracks. During my early career, I spent 3 years working alongside cybersecurity experts recovering deleted assets for bankruptcy courts. I learned that negligent executives always leave a back door open because they fundamentally misunderstand how servers archive data. I bypassed the sanitized folders Chase and his broker curated for the acquisition team. I routed my search through the legacy email servers. I wrote a script to scan the archives for any correspondence containing the name of the predatory lending firm that underwrote the $2.5 million toxic loan. I needed to map the exact timeline of the identity theft. I needed to know exactly when Chase compromised my Social Security number and who else inside the company facilitated the fraud. The search query yielded a single result, hidden deep within an archived folder my brother thought he deleted. It was an email chain dated 3 years ago. I clicked the file. The text populated on my high-resolution monitor. The initial message originated from Chase, sent directly to my father's private email address. My brother wrote the message in a state of obvious panic. He confessed to draining the operating accounts to cover personal debts. He admitted the company was failing. Then he confessed to the ultimate crime. He told Richard he secured a multi-million-dollar lifeline from a private credit fund, but he could not use his own name due to a compromised credit score. He admitted to forging my signature and using my Social Security number to guarantee the loan. Chase begged our father for help, asking how to hide the debt from the corporate accountants. I scrolled down to read my father's response. For a fraction of a second, a small, naive part of my brain expected to see anger. A daughter always harbors a microscopic hope that her parent will protect her when a predator breaches the gates. I expected Richard to reprimand his son, to demand he reverse the fraud or face termination. I expected a father to defend his child. I read the reply. My father did not express anger toward Chase. He expressed irritation at the inconvenience. Richard instructed his son to bury the loan documents in a restricted subfolder. He detailed a method for falsifying the quarterly expense reports to cover the exorbitant interest payments. Then he typed the sentence that severed my final tie to the Harrison bloodline. He told Chase to keep the forgery quiet and let the debt ride. If the company goes under, let Emma take the fall, Richard wrote. She has nothing to lose anyway. She will figure it out. I sat in the quiet chill of my office, staring at the glowing pixels. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. The revelation did not bring tears. It brought a profound, crystalline clarity. My father knew. He knew for 3 years that his golden son placed a loaded gun to my head, and Richard told him to keep his finger on the trigger. He weighed the value of my future against the convenience of protecting his legacy and deemed me expendable. Dead weight. Any lingering hesitation evaporated. The residual guilt that occasionally accompanies the destruction of one's own family vanished. I ceased viewing Richard and Chase as relatives. They transitioned into targets. They became hostile entities requiring systematic neutralization. I closed the email chain, saving a certified copy to a secure external drive. The evidence upgraded my operation from a financial audit to a criminal investigation. I turned my attention back to the asset purchase agreement. The standard template provided by Apex Capital offered robust protections for the buyer, but I needed a mechanism designed specifically to destroy the seller. I drafted a custom liability clause and buried it on page 47 of the dense legal contract. Corporate contracts often include indemnification clauses, but I weaponized this specific paragraph. The clause stated that if Apex Capital discovered any undisclosed fraudulent debt, forged guarantees, or hidden liabilities linked to the seller, the entire structure of the asset purchase would instantly convert. Instead of Apex Capital absorbing the clean assets and leaving the debt behind, the clause granted Apex the right to seize the purchase funds and apply them directly to the fraudulent debt. Furthermore, it stripped the sellers of their corporate limited liability protection, rendering them personally responsible for any remaining balance. If Chase and Richard signed that page, they would forfeit the $10 million, lose the company, and assume personal legal liability for the $2.5 million fraudulent loan. They would essentially sign their own financial death warrants. I packaged the final contract and sent it to their broker. I included one non-negotiable stipulation before the funds could be released into their accounts. Apex Capital required the executive leadership of Harrison Logistics to present a full, in-person audit defense. The sellers needed to sit in a boardroom and verbally verify the accuracy of their financial disclosures to the acquisition team. I anticipated pushback. In-person audits require preparation and expose negligent executives to direct questioning. A smart operator would hesitate. But Chase was not a smart operator. He was a desperate man staring at a mirage of $10 million. The broker replied the following morning. Chase accepted the stipulation without requesting a single revision to the contract. He agreed to travel to the designated law office to finalize the deal. His arrogance blinded him to the hidden snare. He assumed he could walk into a boardroom, flash a charismatic smile, and charm a room full of faceless corporate suits, just as he had done his entire life. He believed he was walking into a coronation. He did not realize the executioner had already sharpened the axe. November rolled into the south carrying a rare, brittle chill that stripped the final leaves from the oak trees lining my father's estate. The Thanksgiving table in his formal dining room resembled a magazine spread designed to sell the illusion of generational wealth. Silver platters held roasted pheasant and heritage turkey. Heavy crystal goblets caught the light from the custom chandelier, illuminating the faces of a family celebrating a phantom victory. I took my assigned seat near the kitchen swinging door, a spot traditionally reserved for the least important guest. I wore a plain beige cashmere sweater, deliberately blending into the background. I played my role, minimizing my physical presence, while my mind categorized every word spoken across the linen tablecloth. Chase sat at the opposite end of the table, radiating a manic, volatile energy. He poured a heavy measure of expensive scotch before my father even spoke the traditional holiday blessing. Lauren leaned into his shoulder, scrolling through premium real estate listings on her mobile phone. She angled the screen so everyone could see the snow-capped peaks of an Aspen chalet. She discussed ski-in access, heated stone floors, and imported timber beams. She priced out interior decorators and private jet charters. They celebrated the impending $10 million payout from Apex Capital, as if the funds had already cleared their offshore accounts. They spent stolen money in their minds, unaware the vault they planned to rob was already empty. Chase raised his scotch glass, pointing the rim toward me. He asked what I planned to do with my minority payout once the sale closed. He assumed my 10% stake would net me a meager sum after he finished applying his imaginary taxes and fabricated legal fees. He suggested I use the small windfall to finally enroll in graduate school, or perhaps start a modest local catering business. Lauren laughed a high, thin sound that grated against the porcelain dinner plates. She told me it was time to leave my cramped apartment behind and secure a real career. She offered to introduce me to a friend who managed a regional boutique, thinking retail management was the ceiling of my professional capabilities. I smiled down at my plate, cutting a piece of dry turkey. I played the possum. In the wild, a possum survives by convincing predators it poses zero threat. It slows its heart rate and mimics death until the danger passes. I chewed my food and looked up with wide, innocent eyes. I needed Chase to feel intellectually superior. I needed his ego to override his basic survival instincts. I asked Chase how a major corporate buyout actually functioned. I kept my voice soft, projecting a profound financial ignorance. I asked if the buyers from Atlanta were going to look at the bad loans on the ledger. I called the crippling debt the scary numbers, making sure to sound terrified of basic corporate mechanics. I tilted my head and asked if the buyers would cancel the entire deal if they found out about the money he owed to those mean bankers in Chicago. Chase swallowed the bait whole. His pride could not resist the opportunity to educate his inferior sister. He leaned back, resting his arm over the back of Lauren's chair. He smirked and began to outline the exact architecture of his federal wire fraud. He spoke loudly, ensuring our father heard his brilliant strategy. He explained how asset purchases function, specifically noting that the buyer only takes the valuable parts of the company while leaving the liabilities behind. I pushed further, asking how he kept the buyers from seeing the bad loan during their background checks. Chase chuckled, taking another sip of his drink. He detailed how he created a secondary internal ledger. He explained the process of shifting the $2.5 million loan off the primary balance sheet and burying it under a defunct holding company that shared a similar name to a legitimate vendor. He laughed while explaining that the corporate suits at Apex Capital were too focused on the lucrative port contracts to dig into the auxiliary tax files. He explicitly stated his intention to take the $10 million dissolve Harrison Logistics and leave the predatory lenders holding an empty bag. Richard nodded along, carving another slice of meat. My father smiled at his son, validating the entire criminal enterprise. He praised Chase for his creative accounting and his ruthless business acumen. He told a story about his early days in shipping, drawing a false parallel between hard work and outright fraud. They did not notice my cell phone resting face down next to my water glass. The screen remained dark, but the internal microphone was active and recording. Alabama law operates under a one-party consent statute for capturing audio. As long as one person participating in the discussion knows the recording is taking place, the file is legally admissible in both state and federal court. I did not need to wiretap a boardroom or hack a secure server to gather evidence. My brother willingly dictated a flawless, uncoerced confession to bank fraud, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy over a plate of cranberry sauce. The dinner slowly wound down. The scent of cinnamon and impending ruin filled the dining room. Richard wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and cleared his throat, turning his sharp gaze toward me. He shifted his focus from celebration to logistics. He reminded me that the final closing was scheduled for Monday morning at a prominent downtown law firm. He extended his hand across the table, demanding I surrender my physical stock certificates right then and there. He claimed his attorneys needed to process the minority shares over the weekend to ensure a seamless transfer of ownership on Monday. Giving him those certificates would relinquish my final piece of leverage. It would allow him to finalize the paperwork without my physical presence in the boardroom. It would give him the power to execute the sale and trigger the trap without looking me in the eye. I could not allow that to happen. The execution required an audience. I reached into my purse, pulling out a plain manila envelope. I tapped it gently against the edge of the mahogany table. I told my father I wanted to keep the documents safe in my own fireproof lockbox over the weekend. I promised to bring the certificates directly to the closing meeting on Monday morning. I smiled, displaying a perfect mask of eager compliance. I assured them I would not miss the final sale for anything in the world. I told them I wanted to see the corporate buyers hand over the check. Richard frowned, his hand hovering over the table. He did not like variables he could not control. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand the envelope, but Chase intervened. Chase laughed, telling our father to let it go. He told me to wear something nice for the corporate buyers, so I did not embarrass the family. He told me to show up early and stay out of the way while the adults handled the multi-million-dollar transaction. I slid the envelope back into my purse and zipped it shut. I looked at my brother and promised him I would wear my best suit. I promised him I would be sitting right there at the table when the deal closed. They returned to their drinks, discussing the color palette for their imaginary ski chalet. I sat quietly in the corner of the dining room, listening to the digital recording saved to my encrypted cloud server. The bait was taken, the confession was secured, and the countdown to Monday morning had officially begun. The Friday morning following Thanksgiving required a change of venue and a shift in strategy. I left the suffocating atmosphere of my father's estate and drove straight back to Atlanta. I bypassed my corporate office and navigated toward a nondescript glass building situated in the financial district. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I walked into the private conference room of Marcus Thorne. Marcus operated as an independent criminal attorney, specializing in white-collar defense and corporate espionage. He possessed a reputation for dissecting complex financial crimes with surgical precision. Sitting across from him at the polished granite table was Special Agent Miller, a veteran investigator with the Federal White-Collar Crime Division. I retained Marcus 2 weeks prior, utilizing my personal savings to ensure attorney-client privilege. Marcus brought Agent Miller into the fold once he reviewed my preliminary findings. Today, I delivered the final pieces of the puzzle. I took a seat, unlatched my briefcase, and began extracting files. I did not offer a tearful narrative about a betrayed daughter. I presented a sterile, chronological timeline of a multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate. I slid the first manila folder across the cold granite. It contained the original commercial loan documents, highlighting the $2.5 million principal and my forged signature. Next, I produced the property records and bank routing numbers, linking the fraudulent vendor payments directly to Lauren and her shell company. Special Agent Miller flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to focused intensity. Federal investigators typically spend months subpoenaing bank records and fighting corporate lawyers just to glimpse the kind of pristine evidence I dropped on his table in 5 minutes. Then I handed Agent Miller a silver flash drive. I told him to press play on the audio file. The recording from the Thanksgiving dinner filled the quiet conference room. Chase's arrogant voice echoed off the glass walls, detailing the exact architecture of his deception. He bragged about creating secondary ledgers, burying the toxic debt, and planning to defraud the corporate buyers from Apex Capital. When the audio concluded, Agent Miller leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He looked at Marcus and then at me. A recorded confession paired with a flawless paper trail is the holy grail of financial prosecution. I was not finished. I slid the final piece of paper across the table. It was the printed email chain from 3 years ago, the correspondence where Chase confessed the forgery to Richard and my father instructed him to let me take the fall. I watched Agent Miller read the printed text. The email elevated the crime from a single desperate act committed by a reckless son to a coordinated criminal conspiracy authorized by the chief executive officer. It proved Richard was not a negligent victim of his son's ambition. He was an active participant in the identity theft. Agent Miller closed the folder and clasped his hands together. He stated he had enough probable cause to walk into the Montgomery logistics office that afternoon and arrest both of them. He offered to dispatch a field team immediately. I shook my head. I told him an immediate arrest would trigger a chaotic regional legal battle. My father would post bail, hire a team of aggressive defense lawyers, and attempt to frame me for the embezzlement. I needed an airtight execution. I looked Agent Miller in the eye and laid out the final phase of my strategy. I explained that Apex Capital was scheduled to close the $10 million asset purchase on Monday morning. If Chase and Richard signed those closing documents, they would formally execute a fraudulent transaction across state lines utilizing digital banking networks. Marcus caught my drift instantly. He nodded, looking at the federal agent. If they sign the Apex contract, they trigger federal wire fraud statutes. The moment the ink dries, they commit a new set of felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. A regional embezzlement case transforms into a federal mandate. Agent Miller agreed. He understood the tactical advantage of allowing the targets to dig a deeper grave. We finalized the timeline. The authorities would hold their warrants over the weekend. They would allow my father and brother to walk into the closing meeting, believing they had won. Federal agents would wait in the lobby of the downtown law firm on Monday morning, ready to move the second the transaction processed. I left the meeting feeling a profound sense of closure. The legal guillotine was hoisted into place. I just needed to guide them to the block. My phone buzzed constantly throughout Saturday and Sunday. Chase was losing his nerve. The closer he got to the multi-million-dollar mirage, the more erratic his behavior became. He sent a barrage of text messages demanding I drive over to his house and hand over my minority stock certificates early. He claimed the lawyers needed them right away to clear a regulatory hurdle. He tried intimidation, telling me to stop playing games and act like an adult. When anger failed, he pivoted to false affection, promising to take me out for an expensive dinner once the sale closed. I read every message, but I did not reply. I turned off my read receipts, leaving him to suffer in a vacuum of silence. His panic fueled my focus. I spent my Saturday afternoon preparing my armor. I walked into a high-end, bespoke tailor in the Buckhead district of Atlanta. For 10 years, I attended family functions wearing beige sweaters and discount department store dresses. I deliberately cultivated an aesthetic of mediocrity to keep them comfortable in their superiority. That era was over. I handed the tailor a premium credit card and requested an expedited fitting for a custom suit. I selected a razor-sharp charcoal gray wool blend. The fabric felt heavy and substantial. I stood in front of the three-way mirror while the tailor pinned the waist and hemmed the trousers. The reflection staring back at me did not belong to the quiet girl who fetched coats at the steakhouse. It belonged to a senior corporate auditor preparing to dismantle a corrupt enterprise. The suit cost $3,000. I considered it a minor operational expense. Sunday night passed in absolute silence. I packed my leather portfolio, checking the documents one final time. I placed the forensic audit, the forged loan paperwork, the recorded audio drive, and the custom liability clause into their designated compartments. I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours, enjoying a deep, dreamless rest. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear. The sunlight reflected off the steel and glass skyscrapers of downtown Birmingham. I parked my car in the underground garage of the prestigious law firm my father retained to handle the corporate sale. I rode the elevator to the 40th floor, carrying my briefcase. The scent of lemon polish and fresh espresso filled the reception area. Inside the primary executive boardroom, the scene was set. The room featured a massive mahogany table surrounded by plush leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city my father believed he conquered. Richard and Chase sat near the head of the table. They wore their finest tailored suits. Chase kept adjusting his silk tie, checking his expensive watch every 30 seconds. Lauren sat in a chair near the window, flipping through a glossy luxury real estate magazine, ready to celebrate her new tax bracket. They murmured quietly to each other, wearing the smug, confident smiles of men who thought they had beaten the system. They waited for the doors to open. They waited for the faceless senior executives from Apex Capital to walk in and hand them $10 million. They waited for their salvation. They did not know I was already in the building. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom remained sealed, shielding the occupants from the bustling law firm outside. Inside the climate-controlled space, Richard and Chase Harrison marinated in their own hubris. They sat side by side along the flank of the 20-foot mahogany table. Their retained counsel, a pair of expensive transactional attorneys, arranged thick stacks of closing documents into neat piles. Lauren occupied a corner leather chair, crossing her legs and tapping a manicured fingernail against the screen of her mobile phone. She was already calculating the square footage of her future mountain retreat. Chase checked his heavy silver watch, adjusting the French cuffs of his tailored shirt. He projected the posture of a conqueror awaiting his tribute. Richard leaned back, resting his hands over his stomach, radiating the smug satisfaction of a patriarch who believed he had successfully cheated both the financial system and his own bloodline. They expected a team of gullible, out-of-state investors to walk through those doors and hand them salvation wrapped in a $10 million wire transfer. They expected to sign away their failing logistics company, shed their toxic liabilities, and step into a life of unearned luxury. The brass handle of the boardroom door turned with a heavy mechanical click. The quiet conversations inside the room ceased instantly. Richard straightened his posture, plastering a welcoming, transactional smile across his face. Chase stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, preparing to exude Southern corporate charm. Lauren put her phone away, sitting up straight and smoothing her designer dress. The twin transactional attorneys adjusted their silk ties. The heavy doors swung open, pulling a rush of cool air into the stagnant room. I walked across the threshold. I did not wear a beige cardigan or a discount department store dress. I wore the $3,000 bespoke charcoal wool suit I purchased in the Buckhead district. The cut was immaculate, the lines razor-sharp, armor forged for a modern execution. I did not walk with the hesitant, quiet steps of a dutiful daughter fetching a coat at a steakhouse. I moved with the measured, predatory cadence of a senior executive entering her domain. Flanking me on my left and right were three of the most ruthless corporate litigators employed by Apex Capital. They wore dark-tailored suits and carried heavy leather briefcases, projecting an aura of institutional lethality. Trailing a few steps behind them was a private security contractor, dressed in a dark suit, a subtle communication device resting in his left ear. The eager smiles plastered across the faces of my father and brother froze. The muscles in their jaws locked as their brains struggled to process the visual information presented to them. They expected a team of middle-aged Atlanta bankers. Instead, they saw the woman they had spent a decade treating as a glorified secretary, leading a phalanx of corporate muscle. The silence in the boardroom stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire. Chase broke the quiet first. A sharp, nervous laugh escaped his throat, echoing awkwardly off the glass walls. He looked at me and then looked past my shoulder into the empty hallway, searching for the real buyers. He assumed I was a clerical error. He assumed I arrived early to deliver my minority stock certificates and accidentally walked in alongside the acquisition team. "Emma, what are you doing right now?" Chase asked, his voice dripping with forced patience and underlying irritation. He took a step forward, waving his hand in a dismissive shooing motion. "You are early. The closing meeting is restricted to primary shareholders and the purchasing executives. You need to step outside and wait in the reception area before the people from Apex get here. You are going to embarrass us." I did not stop walking. I ignored his command, bypassing the side chairs designated for guests and moving directly to the head of the mahogany table, the seat of power, the position traditionally reserved for the individual controlling the capital. I pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down. My three attorneys filed in, taking the seats immediately to my left and right, forming a unified wall of legal defense. The security contractor took a position standing by the closed doors, crossing his arms and surveying the room with cold detachment. Richard stared at me from down the table. The smug satisfaction melted from his features, replaced by a creeping unease. He recognized the shift in my posture and the quality of the fabric draped over my shoulders. 10 years ago, he pointed a carving knife at me and declared me dead weight. For a decade, he profited from my perceived insignificance. Now, he watched his invisible daughter command a room full of apex predators. His eyes darted to the men sitting beside me, attempting to decipher the hierarchy. Emma, Richard warned, his tone, dropping into the low, gravelly register he used to intimidate subordinates. "Get out of that chair. This is a multi-million-dollar corporate transaction, not a family gathering. Have you lost your mind?" I placed my leather portfolio on the polished wood. The click of the brass latch sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I opened the flap and reached inside. My movements deliberate and unhurried. I extracted a crisp, white rectangle of heavy cardstock. I placed the business card flat on the table and slid it across the smooth surface. The card glided over the polished mahogany, coming to a rest directly in front of my father. Richard looked down. The embossed silver lettering caught the overhead light. It read, "Emma Harrison, Senior Lead Acquisition Director, Apex Capital." I let him read the title twice. I watched his eyes track the letters, tracing the connection between the daughter he discarded and the faceless corporate entity he thought would save him. The color drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen gray pallor. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There was no gullible out-of-state investor. There was no easy escape. The entity he had been negotiating with, the person who drafted the letter of intent, the buyer he thought he outsmarted, was sitting at the head of the table. I looked my father dead in the eye. My voice remained calm, steady, and devoid of any familial warmth. "I am the buyer, Richard," I stated. The words hung in the air, cold and irrefutable. "And your valuation is officially 0. Lauren let out a confused gasp, standing up from her chair in the corner. Chase stood frozen, his brain misfiring as the logic of the situation crashed down upon him. He looked at the business card sitting in front of our father, and then looked back at me. The patronizing smirk he wore for 32 years finally shattered. He realized the woman he mocked at the country club, the woman he tried to buy out for $50,000, was the exact person who engineered the acquisition of his failing empire. "This is a joke," Chase stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "This is some kind of sick joke. You do not work for Apex Capital. You are a low-level paper pusher. You do not have the authority to negotiate a $10 million asset purchase." I gestured to the lead attorney sitting to my right. He opened his own briefcase and produced a stack of bound legal documents. He slid the official corporate charter and my verified authorization forms across the table. "Apex Capital tasked me with the complete restructuring of Harrison Logistics," I replied, projecting my voice to reach the corners of the room. "I authored every email your broker received. I drafted the asset purchase agreement you are so desperate to sign today. I own this transaction." The air in the boardroom grew thin. The walls seemed to close in around my brother. The facade of the wealthy, successful executive crumbled away, leaving a panicked, frantic criminal exposed to the light. The reality of his situation began to suffocate him. He needed that $10 million to cover his fraudulent loans and fund his exit strategy. Without the sale, he faced immediate bankruptcy and potential prison time. He realized I held his entire life in my hands, and I had just closed my fist. A dark, mottled red flush crept up Chase's neck and spread across his face. The panic mutated into raw, unhinged hostility. He could not outsmart me, and he could not intimidate me with financial jargon. His intellect failed him, so he reverted to primal aggression. He planted his hands on the table, his knuckles turning white. "You think you can play games with my company?" Chase roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You think you can walk in here wearing a new suit and cancel my deal? I will destroy you, Emma. I will drag you through the courts until you have nothing left." He did not wait for her response. Chase lunged across the wide mahogany table, his arm outstretched, his fingers grasping wildly for the portfolio of documents resting in front of me. He intended to physically seize the contracts, to tear the evidence apart with his bare hands. He never made it past the center of the table. The private security contractor stationed by the door moved with terrifying speed. Before Chase could touch the leather binder, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. The contractor grabbed the collar of my brother Tailored's suit and yanked him backward with bone-jarring force. Chase lost his footing, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction on the polished hardwood floor. The security guard shoved him hard into his leather chair, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The guard stepped forward, blocking Chase's path to the table, his stance wide and his hand resting casually near his hip. He issued a single, low command, telling my brother to remain seated and keep his hands visible. Chase gasped for air, staring up at the guard, his chest heaving, his pristine suit jacket rumpled and twisted. He sat trapped in his chair, pinned down by the reality of his own making. The ambush was complete, and the execution was about to begin. Chase collapsed into the deep leather upholstery of his chair, gasping for air. His chest heaved against his tailored shirt, while his hands gripped the armrests in a white-knuckled panic. The private security contractor stepped back just a fraction of an inch, maintaining a wide, balanced stance between my brother and the head of the mahogany table. The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to command the space. Anger is an undisciplined emotion, and I left mine back in my 20s. I operated with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease. We are going to conduct this meeting according to the agenda I stated, looking down the length of the table. I unclasped the secondary compartment of my leather portfolio and extracted 6 thickly bound presentation folders. I slid them across the polished wood, distributing copies to the twin transactional attorneys, my father and my brother. Turn to page 4. The lawyers hesitated, looking toward Richard for permission before reaching for the documents. Their hesitation proved they understood the shifting power dynamic. They opened the folders. I watched their eyes scan the top sheet. The document was a comprehensive forensic audit of Harrison Logistics. I spent my entire career mapping the anatomy of financial ruin, and I mapped this particular corpse down to the marrow. You pitched Apex Capital a thriving shipping enterprise expanding into the Mobile port. I began, my tone steady and rhythmic. The data indicates a hollow shell, propped up by systematic fraud. Your gross revenue barely covers the interest on your undisclosed debts. Your operating capital has been consistently siphoned into a phantom entity known as Summit Marketing Solutions. Lauren recoiled in her corner chair as if struck by a physical blow. The color drained from her face. She looked at Chase, but he kept his eyes glued to the table. I detailed the exact dates and amounts routed to the mail forwarding service she operated. I watched the transactional attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. They were retained to facilitate a legal asset sale, not to participate in an active crime scene. A lawyer values their bar license far more than their client, and I could see them calculating their own legal exposure. Richard slammed his open palm against the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water glasses. The sudden noise was a desperate attempt to reclaim his fading authority. "That is enough," Richard barked, his voice thick with Southern entitlement. "I am your father, Emma. I built this company with my bare hands long before you were born. I will not sit here and let an ungrateful child lecture me about my own ledgers. You demand respect when you sit at my table." I looked at him, recognizing the fragile ego of a man who equated fear with respect. "You are not a father right now, Richard. You are the chief executive officer of a failing logistics firm sitting across from your primary creditor," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his. "And this is not your table. You rent this boardroom by the hour. I am dismantling your company by the minute." I turned a page in my own binder. My attorneys followed suit, mirroring my movements. I reached into the portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. I slid it down the center of the table, stopping it directly between Chase and Richard. "Let us discuss the toxic debt," I continued. Page 12 of the audit details a $2.5 million commercial loan issued by a predatory private credit fund out of Chicago. It carries a 14% interest rate and a balloon payment triggering in less than 2 months. This loan does not appear on your primary balance sheet. You buried it under a defunct holding company. Chase swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He refused to look at the paper in the plastic sleeve. He knew exactly what it was. The lender required a clean credit profile for the guarantor, I explained, speaking to the room but staring at my brother. Since the executive suite already carried compromised credit scores, you utilized a stolen identity. You forged my signature and attached my Social Security number to a multi-million-dollar liability. It was a mistake, Chase stammered, his voice thin and reedy. I was going to pay it off with the acquisition money. The sale was supposed to clear the books. No one was going to get hurt, Emma. We are family. You did not forge my name because we are family, I countered. You forged it because you considered me disposable. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small, silver digital recorder. I placed it on the table and pressed the play button. The audio quality was pristine. The ambient clinking of silverware and crystal glasses filled the boardroom, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of Chase bragging at the Thanksgiving dinner table. His recorded voice echoed off the glass walls, detailing his brilliant strategy to hide the toxic loan from the corporate buyers. The recording captured him explaining how he planned to take the acquisition funds, dissolve the original company, and leave the predatory lenders holding an empty bag. It captured Richard laughing and validating the fraud. The recording ended. The silence that followed was dense enough to crush stone. The two transactional attorneys closed their briefcases simultaneously. They pushed their chairs back from the table, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. Hearing a client plot to defraud an investment group on tape terminated any remaining attorney-client privilege under the crime-fraud exception. Chase shook his head, his hands trembling over the polished wood. "You cannot stop the sale," he whispered, his voice cracking. He grasped at a final desperate straw. "You signed the waiver at the barbecue. You signed away your right to block this transaction. I filed it with the state tax board on Friday. You have no legal standing to halt this buyout." I smiled. It was the first genuine expression I allowed myself all morning. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an architect watching a demolition charge detonate exactly on schedule. "I did sign a waiver," I acknowledged, "but you never bothered to verify the signature." I gestured to the lead Apex attorney sitting to my right. He produced a certified copy of the state shareholder waiver and handed it to Chase. My brother stared at the bottom of the page. 10 years ago, I established a rigid block print signature for documents signed under duress or fraudulent intent. I explained, watching his eyes scan the letters. That specific print pattern holds zero legal validity across all my registered financial institutions. It is a dead signature. The waiver you filed on Friday is void. I retain full minority shareholder rights. Chase dropped the paper, his breathing ragged. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the lever pull back. "However," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, steady cadence, "the asset purchase agreement you signed with Apex Capital yesterday is fully binding. I suggest you turn to page 47. Richard and Chase scrambled to open the thick contracts resting in front of them. Their fingers fumbled with the heavy paper, tearing the corners in their haste. They found the page. I authored a custom liability clause specifically for this transaction. I stated, watching them read the dense legal text, "The clause stipulates that if Apex Capital discovers undisclosed fraudulent debt linked to the seller, the structure of the purchase instantly converts. Apex Capital is seizing your viable shipping routes, fleet vehicles, and port contracts for pennies on the dollar. The remaining purchase funds are not going into your offshore accounts. They are being applied directly to the predatory loan you tried to hide." Richard looked up, his eyes wide with a terrifying comprehension. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, refusing to produce a sound. "Furthermore," I said, delivering the final, fatal blow, The indemnification clause strips you of your corporate limited liability protections. Chase, you signed as the primary executive officer. You are now personally liable for the remaining $2.5 million debt. Your houses, your cars, your country club memberships. The banks will take it all. Lauren let out a sharp, piercing sob, burying her face in her hands. The pristine illusion of her wealth shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chase slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cool mahogany wood, defeated, broken, and ruined. I stood up from the head of the table, smoothing the jacket of my tailored suit. I looked down at the men who spent 10 years treating me like an invisible servant. There is one more detail, I added, picking up my leather portfolio. My firm maintains a strict policy regarding corporate fraud. We always notify the authorities before finalizing a hostile restructure. I nodded to the security contractor by the door. He reached for the brass handle and pulled the heavy oak doors open. Standing in the reception area, illuminated by the soft morning light, were 3 federal agents dressed in dark windbreakers. They stepped into the boardroom, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing against the polished floor. The visual of 3 federal agents stepping across the threshold of the boardroom permanently altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. Special Agent Miller led the formation. He did not wear a bespoke suit or carry a luxury briefcase. He wore a standard-issue Navy windbreaker with the gold shield of the Federal Bureau pinned to his belt. He represented the absolute immovable force of the United States government. The 2 transactional attorneys hired by my father did not wait for an introduction. They stood up in unison, abandoning their legal pads and gold pens on the mahogany table. They pressed their backs against the glass walls, physically distancing themselves from the blast radius of their soon-to-be former clients. In the corporate legal sector, proximity to active federal wire fraud is a career death sentence. They watched the agents advance with wide, unblinking eyes. Special Agent Miller pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. He did not yell. He delivered the reality of the situation with a flat, bureaucratic monotone that cut through the silence like a scalpel. He announced that he held active arrest warrants for Jacob Chase Harrison and Richard Harrison. He listed the charges with methodical precision: conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, interstate wire fraud. Each felony carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. There would be no high-priced regional judges to bribe. There would be no country club favors to call in. The federal justice system operates on a 97% conviction rate, and Agent Miller had just walked in holding a recorded confession and a flawless paper trail. The facade of the Golden Southern family shattered instantly. The psychological collapse of my brother occurred in real time. Facing the terrifying prospect of a 20-year prison sentence, the arrogant executive vanished. A cornered, terrified animal replaced him. Chase looked at the federal agents and then whipped his head toward our father. The instinct for self-preservation eradicated 32 years of familial loyalty in a fraction of a second. "It was his idea!" Chase screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger directly at Richard. "I went to him 3 years ago. I told him about the commercial loan. I told him about the signature. I wanted to come clean and pay it back, but he told me to hide it. He told me to bury the paperwork in the holding company so the auditors would not find it. He orchestrated the entire cover-up." Chase scrambled backward, knocking his heavy leather chair into the credenza. He held his hands up in a placating gesture toward Agent Miller, desperate to trade his own blood for a plea deal. "He has secret accounts," Chase babbled, spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. "Richard skims from the employee pension fund to cover his private country club dues. I can show you the ledgers. I can give you everything you need to lock him up. Just keep those handcuffs away from me. I was just following the orders of the chief executive officer." My father absorbed the betrayal with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The man who built an empire built it on a foundation of blind loyalty. He expected his son to fall on his sword to protect the family name. Instead, his chosen heir offered his throat to the wolves without a moment of hesitation. The shock mutated into a violent, volcanic rage. Richard lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table with both hands, his knuckles turning bone white. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. "You worthless, parasitic coward," Richard roared, the sound echoing violently off the boardroom walls. "I gave you everything. I handed you a multi-million-dollar enterprise on a silver platter, and you drove it straight into the ground. You are a failure, Chase. You have always been a failure. You spent my money, you ruined my legacy, and now you stand there crying like an infant. You are no son of mine." Richard slammed his fist onto the table, cursing the day he handed the vice presidency to a man incapable of reading a basic amortization schedule. He screamed that he should have let Chase rot in his own debt years ago. He hurled insults, stripping away every unearned title and accolade my brother ever received. The patriarchal mask dissolved completely, revealing a bitter, vicious old man watching his entire life burn to ashes. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I watched the two men who called me dead weight tear each other apart like rats trapped in a flooding sewer. They spent a decade united by their shared contempt for my existence. The moment true adversity breached their walls, they cannibalized one another. Their bond was entirely transactional, built on a shared delusion of superiority. Stripped of their stolen capital, they possessed nothing but venom. In the corner of the room, the third member of their fragile alliance initiated her own exit strategy. Lawrence stood up from her chair. The glossy real estate magazine slipped from her lap and landed on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. She stared at Chase with an expression of profound, visceral disgust. She processed the federal charges, the seizure of assets, and the reality of a destitute future. The leased Porsche Panamera would be repossessed by the end of the week. The bank would foreclose on the country club estate. The diamond promise ring on her finger would likely be seized as a corporate asset purchased with stolen funds. The Aspen chalet evaporated into thin air. Chase turned toward his wife, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Lauren," he pleaded, taking a step toward her. "Call your father. Tell him I need a bail bondsman. Tell him to wire a retainer to a defense attorney. We can fight this. We can fix this." Lauren looked at him as if he were a stranger coated in something foul. She did not offer a tearful declaration of loyalty. She did not promise to wait for him. She reached down, picking up her imported designer handbag. She adjusted the leather strap over her shoulder, keeping her gaze locked on his ruined face. "There is no we, Chase," she stated, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You are broke and you are going to prison. Do not ever contact me again." She turned on her heel and walked toward the open boardroom doors. She sidestepped the federal agents without looking back at the man she married. The sharp, authoritative click of her stiletto heels echoed down the marble hallway, a steady, rhythmic countdown to total isolation. She abandoned the sinking ship the moment the water touched her shoes. Special Agent Miller gestured to the two agents standing behind him. They moved forward with practiced, terrifying efficiency. The first agent grabbed Chase by the shoulder, spinning him around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting shut sliced through the chaotic shouting. The sound signified the absolute end of their reign. The second agent approached Richard. My father did not fight. The fight had drained out of him the moment his legacy collapsed. He turned around, offering his wrists to the federal agent staring blankly at the polished wood of the boardroom table. Agent Miller began to recite the Miranda warning. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The bureaucratic poetry of the justice system filled the room, drowning out my brother's frantic, ragged breathing. I reached out and closed my leather portfolio, locking the brass latch. I picked up my briefcase, preparing to leave the wreckage behind. I stood up from the executive chair, smoothing the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I began to walk toward the exit, my security contractor stepping aside to clear a path. As I passed the center of the table, Chase struggled against the grip of the federal agent. He twisted his body, turning his head to look at me. The arrogance, the condescension, the mocking laughter from a decade ago were completely gone. Tears streamed down his flushed cheeks. His chest heaved against his ruined silk tie. "Emma, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate sob. "Please, tell them to stop. Tell them you made a mistake. You can drop the charges. We can figure out the money. You cannot do this to us. We are family." I stopped walking. I turned my head, looking at the handcuffed man standing in the ruins of his own greed. I looked at my father standing silently beside him, his head bowed in total defeat. I allowed the word family to hang in the air for a single, deliberate second. I weighed against the 10 years of humiliation, the stolen identity, the forged loans, and the calculated plan to bury me alive. "Family is a liability I no longer carry," I replied. I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Birmingham provided a stark contrast to the plush mahogany boardrooms my father preferred. The air felt sterile, smelling of floor wax and institutional bleach. I sat in the back row of the gallery, wearing the same tailored charcoal suit from the acquisition meeting. I watched the American justice system process the men who once believed they were untouchable. Federal judges do not care about country club memberships or regional logistics empires. They care about wire fraud statutes, forged signatures, and stolen identities. The presiding judge read the final sentence aloud. 60 months in a federal penitentiary, 5 years without the possibility of early parole. Chase stood before the heavy wooden bench wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The arrogance, the leased sports cars, the custom-tailored shirts, all vanished. He looked pale, trembling, as the armed bailiff guided him toward the holding cell door. He traded a life of unearned luxury for a concrete block in a federal facility. He would spend the rest of his youth wearing a number instead of a title. Lauren did not attend the sentencing hearing to support her husband. She filed for divorce the morning following the arrest, severing her legal ties with surgical precision. She packed her designer handbags, her jewelry, and her expensive shoes, moving back into her parents' gated estate. She attempted to petition the court for spousal support, but the judge swiftly denied the request. You cannot extract alimony from a man who possesses a negative net worth. Her loyalty carried a strict expiration date tied directly to a bank routing number. She left him to face the federal prosecutors alone, a fitting end for a marriage built entirely on stolen capital. My father did not fare much better. Richard avoided prison time by signing a comprehensive plea agreement, cooperating with the federal investigation, and surrendering every asset he owned. The federal government seized his bank accounts, his investment portfolios, and his retirement funds to satisfy the massive commercial loan penalty. The prestigious country club formally revoked his membership overnight, desperate to avoid the public scandal of associating with a convicted fraudster. The banks foreclosed on the sprawling mansion in the gated community. He currently rents a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the industrial district, living on a fixed government stipend and nursing his ruined legacy. He spends his days sitting on a cheap patio chair, staring at the highway he used to dominate. While they navigated the brutal reality of the criminal justice system, I executed the corporate restructure. I did not allow the logistics firm to dissolve into the ether, destroying the livelihoods of innocent employees. I finalized the asset purchase agreement on behalf of Apex Capital. We carved out the toxic debt, anchoring it permanently to my father and brother. We retained the viable shipping routes, the port contracts, and the physical fleet. The warehouse workers, the truck drivers, the dispatchers, the people who actually generated the daily revenue kept their jobs. My first act as the new managing director involved restructuring their compensation packages. They received improved healthcare benefits and a matching retirement plan funded by the diverted capital we salvaged from the phantom marketing schemes. We rebranded the entity under a new corporate umbrella, erasing the Harrison name from the side of the transport trucks forever. The final ledger, however, required one last entry to balance. The true climax of the conflict did not end in the federal courtroom. It concluded at the county bankruptcy auction. During the systematic liquidation of my father's personal estate, the banks auctioned off his foreclosed mansion to satisfy the remaining creditors. Richard assumed a nameless real estate developer would purchase the property. He assumed he could walk away with a microscopic sliver of dignity, knowing strangers slept in his custom-built home. He did not read the fine print of the minority shareholder agreement he forced upon me at the steakhouse. The 10% stake he gave me to act as a leash contained a standard minority priority clause. In the event of a total corporate liquidation, my minority shares granted me first right of refusal on all auctioned collateral tied to the executive officers. I attended the foreclosure auction in person. I stood in the back of the municipal hall listening to the auctioneer rattle off the bids. I utilized my private equity performance bonuses and purchased the sprawling family estate for pennies on the dollar. I did not buy the property to live in it. I bought it to repurpose it. I transferred the property deed to a local nonprofit organization specializing in transitional housing for domestic abuse survivors. I turned the monument to his fragile ego into a sanctuary for people escaping control. I visited my father at his cramped apartment to deliver the eviction and transfer notices personally. I climbed the exterior concrete stairs and knocked on the hollow wooden door. He answered wearing a faded robe, his posture stooped, his eyes hollow and defeated. I handed him the legal folder containing the property deed transfer. He opened the folder, reading the official municipal paperwork. His hands shook, causing the pages to tremble. He looked up at me, realizing the full scope of his defeat. He realized I did not just take his company. I took his history. I took his kingdom and gave it to vulnerable strangers. He tried to speak to muster a final cutting insult, but his voice failed. The vocabulary of a dictator disappears when he no longer possesses an army. I turned and walked down the concrete stairs, leaving him alone in the profound silence he created. I sit in my new corner office on the top floor of the Apex Capitol Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows offer a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline. The morning sun reflects off the surrounding glass, casting long, bright angles across my polished mahogany desk. I do not keep many personal items in my workspace. I prefer clean lines and highly functional design. I maintain one single photograph, framed in polished silver, resting near my computer monitor. It is not a picture of my family. It is a photograph of me standing alone on the docks of the Mobile port the morning we finalized the acquisition. I am wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility vest, smiling a genuine, authentic smile. The wind is catching my hair, and the cargo ships loom in the background. I look at that photograph every morning before I log into the global financial networks. It serves as a daily reminder of the true currency I hold. 10 years ago, a powerful man sat at the head of a formal dining table, pointed a carving knife at my chest, and called me dead weight. He evaluated my worth based on my silence. My brother laughed, assuming my quiet demeanor signaled intellectual weakness. They believed a person who does not fight back loudly is a person incapable of fighting at all. They fundamentally misunderstood the physics of leverage. They thought dead weight meant I could not move. They thought it meant I would sink to the bottom of the ocean and drown while they sailed away on the surface, enjoying the spoils of their theft. They never bothered to study the mechanics of a trap. If you want to capture a predator, you do not chase it through the woods making noise. You find the exact spot where it hunts, you set the snare, you wait patiently in the shadows, and you use dead weight to anchor the trap to the ground, so when the steel jaws finally snap shut, the prey can never drag it away. I look out over the Atlanta skyline as the evening traffic begins to snake through the city's streets. 10 years ago, I was an invisible girl sitting at a mahogany table, swallowing insults while my family carved up my future. Today, I am the architect of my own empire, and the men who tried to bury me are currently paying off their debts to society. The journey from that sweltering Alabama dining room to this executive suite taught me how to survive in a world that routinely underestimates quiet women. I did not just survive the wreckage they created. I engineered a masterclass in accountability. The satisfaction I feel is not born from malice, but from the pure application of consequences. They thought they could discard me without a second thought, leaving me to drown in their mistakes. Instead, they handed me the exact tools I needed to build my own lifeboat and sink their yacht. Looking back at the decade I spent building this trap, I realized that surviving a toxic family requires more than just endurance. It requires a fundamental shift in how you view your own worth and how you respond to betrayal. I walked away from the ashes of my father and brother with 5 distinct truths that govern my life today. First, I learned that silence is a weapon. When arrogant people mistake your quiet demeanor for compliance, they freely hand you the blueprints to their own destruction. You do not need to scream to prove you are strong. You just need to listen, gather your data, and strike when the math is undeniably in your favor. Second, I discovered that financial literacy is the ultimate armor. Emotional boundaries are important, but understanding how money moves, how contracts bind, and how liabilities transfer is what truly protects you from predators. They used my name to steal millions because they thought I could not read a balance sheet. I used a balance sheet to legally dismantle their entire existence. Third, I realized that real power never needs to perform. My brother drove leased sports cars, and my father hosted lavish dinners to project an illusion of invincibility. People who possess genuine wealth and actual authority do not waste their energy trying to convince a room of their importance. They let their execution speak for them. Fourth, I learned that true justice is constructive. I did not just burn their company to the ground. I salvaged the viable assets, protected the innocent employees, and turned a monument of patriarchal ego into a safe haven for vulnerable people. Destroying a monster means nothing if you do not use the remaining bricks to build a sanctuary. Finally, I learned that dead weight is the most dangerous force in the room. When the people who are supposed to love you label you a burden, they fundamentally misunderstand the physics of leverage. You can use their underestimation to anchor yourself to the ground, holding steady while they blindly walk into the snare. Family betrayal is a devastating reality for far too many people, but you do not have to accept the narrative they write for you. You have the power to audit your own life, rewrite the contracts, and reclaim your stolen equity. If my journey from a discarded daughter to a corporate victor resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Maye Tells Stories. Share your own experiences in the comments below, because your voice might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to escape their own trap. Thank you for listening, and remember that the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding the keys.